Howdy, howdy, AL-BINO here. How y'all doing today? Sorry I haven't made my weekly installment for a little while. Got some family property issues going on here, so got to do what we got to do, right? So, anyways, seems that everybody in the space is talking about men versus women. So I figured I'd throw in my 2 cents too. Plus, we want to talk about black and white men. So, foundational white male Americans and foundational black male Americans being the least protected demographic. It's no longer white man versus black man. No, it's both. So, foundational white and black male Americans are the least protected, least respected, and most discriminated against demographic in the United States, period. And I will prove it. Because I saw a YouTube video earlier today, and he was talking about mostly white Americans, but I got to thinking, I was like, wait a minute. In my lifetime experience, I've seen what the man was talking about, but it wasn't just white men. It was white and black men together. So, let's start off with the daughters of Zelophahad, okay? In the Bible, in the book of Exodus, when they were setting out in the Torah, Moses was setting forth the law and how property was supposed to be handed down through the family and everything else. Property was supposed to go first to the oldest male child, unless that male child either dishonored the family or passed away. Then to the next male child, unless he dishonored the family and passed away, so on and so forth. And it was very male dominated. But there was this one man who didn't have any male children. He's like, hey, wait a minute. You know, all I have is daughters. So how do I pass down my inheritance? He asked Moses, and Moses went to God and talked to the Israeli elders and stuff like that. He prayed about it and everything else. And he came back with the answer, and he said, okay, check this out. Your daughters can have your inheritance if they marry a man from your tribe. And then you can adopt him, your son-in-law as your son, and then pass your inheritance to your daughter through him. Okay? Now, that has 2 important points of relevancy when it comes to the scripture. One was because Jesus, being of the royal line of David, he had to be both of the legal royal line and the bloodline. Now remember, in the Bible, Jesus was immaculately conceived, meaning that the Holy Spirit caused Mary to conceive without knowing a man. So even though Mary was betrothed to be married to Joseph of the line of David, the royal line, in the tribe of Judah, legally Joseph would be his adopted father, so he would meet the legal requirement, but Mary, and this is proven in the differences between the genealogies in Matthew and in Luke, Mary was also of the line of David, of the tribe of Judah. So Jesus was legally and by blood of that royal line, therefore fulfilling the scriptures, the covenant that the Lord made with David and everything else, right? Okay. That's the one aspect of the one important part of the daughters of Zelophahad. The second important aspect is that in order for that daughter to realize the inheritance, if she had no brothers, she still had to marry a man of her tribe. So say, for example, we had a woman in the tribe of Benjamin. She had no brothers in her family, but her father had an inheritance to pass down. Then she would have to marry another man from the tribe of Benjamin, so that way her father could adopt his son-in-law as his legal son and pass that inheritance to him. Because Western civilization, organized civilization, hierarchical civilization, godly civilization still follows the hierarchy of man, or God, man, women, children. So in order to satisfy that, along with keeping the prophecy of Christ, that's where you have the daughters of Zelophahad. Okay? Now, feminism, as we know it today, is the spirit of Jezebel. Okay? Because it seeks to break that. If you go back to my video where I was up in the mountains in New Mexico by that stream, and I was talking about emotion versus discernment, yes, God did create men and women equally as human beings, okay? But He did not create them with the same characteristics. So women are supposed to have the instinct of nurture, meaning that they nest. They're supposed to maintain the home and maintain the children. And then, of course, the grandchildren can help the women that follow on behind them. Okay? This is also in the Bible. Paul writes about this. Timothy writes about this. Titus writes about this. Okay? It's also in the Jewish law. It's also in the Quran. Okay? So this is Western civilization, Abrahamic religion, Christian, Muslim, Jewish tradition. All right, if you go over on the other side of Eurasia and you look at the Asian cultures, there also you see a similar pattern. On the African continent, all the tribes, even if the family name is passed down through the women, which in some tribes it is, those tribes are still led by men. Okay? In Native American culture, before the arrival of the Europeans, you can see that too. I made videos about that. And why in some Native American cultures 400 or 500 years ago, it changed from patriarchal and patrilineal to matriarchal and matrilineal. But that was because of an emasculation aspect due to slavery. The same could be said about Irish and Negro slaves too. Okay? In order to enslave a people, in order to make them chaotic, disorganized, and then easier to control, easier to manipulate, You have to remove masculinity. And isn't it funny today? Those on the left designed to remove patriarchy and patrilinealism to cause chaos, because then it will be easier for us while we are in our chaos to ride in as the supposed white knight and control us. So what they did to the Native Americans, what they did to the black slaves, now they're going to try to do to everybody. Okay? Men, we have to stand up. Masculinity is what maintains societies. Period. I'm not talking about guys who abuse their masculinity or beat men or beat women or anything like that. But what I am talking about is men asserting authority, responsibility, and power starting in the home and working out from there to maintain, protect, and to build society. Which leads me to my next point. Did you know that there is only one thing that women can do that men cannot do? And that is to bear children. That's the only thing that women can do that men cannot do. Actually, two things: bear children and produce milk. So those are the only two things that women can do that men cannot do. Let's pretend that I want to build a raised bed in my garden. Okay? And instead of using those cheap-ass treated 4x4 posts, which a lot of women do to make raised beds in their gardens or to section off their gardens, because that's the only thing they can pick up, I'm going to do it the right way. So I'm going to go get 9-foot standard railroad ties and a chainsaw to construct this raised bed in my garden, right? Now, I'm 5 feet 10 inches tall. I weigh 220 pounds. I bench press about 385 pounds. Alright? I load those railroad ties up in my trailer. Let's say that my trailer carries 5,000 pounds. Railroad tie weighs 200 to 220 pounds. So I stack 20 of them in that trailer. That's somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 pounds of weight. You know, I go to the lumber yard, pick up the railroad ties, and drive the trailer home. And I go to pull those railroad ties out and start setting them up to build my raised bed, right? Or raised beds for my garden. Or the terraces for my garden. I can grab that railroad tie, drag it out of the trailer by myself. Each one of those, right? Drag it out of the trailer, stand it up, put my shoulder against it, dead center or a little past dead center, lean back, carry that railroad tie on my shoulder to where I need it to be, and drop it on the ground. I can do it for all 20 of those railroad ties by myself. One woman cannot do that. Two women cannot do that. Let's say I want to re-roof the garage. Okay. So a roll of tar paper, if I'm going to use tar paper to do it, a roll of tar paper weighs about 90 to 100 pounds. Thing of shingles weighs 70 to 100 pounds. Depends on the shingles, right? Depends on what I use. So after I get the felt paper laid down, or put the planking up, and each sheet of plywood, 3/4 inch weatherproof plywood or OSB, is going to be about 70 or 80 pounds a sheet. So I got to, after I knock everything off the roof, right, and pull all the decking off, in order to put that decking off, that decking up, that felt up, and get those shingles up, I got to take each one of those pieces, climb a ladder, and I could pick up a piece of plywood by myself, 3/4 inch plywood by myself, or tie it up and pull it up. Each of them weighs probably about 3/4 inch plywood weighs about 90 pounds. So I gotta somehow either carry it or hoist it 8 or 9 feet in the air, maneuver it into position, which I can do by myself, secure it, each one of those pieces, right, repeatedly. Might take me a week or so to get the whole job done, but I can do it. I have the muscular strength to do that by myself. So how many women would it take to carry a railroad tie? 2? Maybe. Most times it might take 4. How many women would it take to climb a ladder repeatedly, up and down, up and down, up and down, shuttle all that stuff up on that roof? Can a woman hold a 70-pound, 80-pound, 90-pound, 100-pound roll of tar paper or bundle of shingles, balance it on her shoulder, and walk up a ladder? Can she balance a piece of plywood on her shoulder or on her back and walk up a ladder, or tie it off and pull it up? 3/4 inch plywood, 90 to 100 pounds, by herself? Or would it take 2 or more? And then to maneuver those pieces into place, hold them into place while they get nailed or screwed down without falling off or hurting herself. Can she do it? No. Let's talk about it in the kitchen, all right? Now, yeah, you've got Giada De Laurentiis and Rachel Ray and Julia Childs. Okay, cool. But for every one of them, I could give you 3 Emeril Lagasse's, or 3 Gordon Ramsays. Go in a restaurant, and what are most of your chefs? Men. So women are real good at doing ham hocks and beans, but will women go grab a cord of firewood, hardwood, not pine, hardwood, oak, mesquite, hickory, that includes pecan and walnut, those are hickory type trees, right? Ash, black or honey locust, apple, cherry, whatever type of hardwood you're going to use to put in your smoker. They're going to go and grab a cord of that, cut those trees down, drag or section up those trunks, drag them onto a trailer, bring them home, cut them down into rounds, split them, soak them, then take a side of an animal or a rack of ribs or whatever, and then cook it and then smoke it. How many women do that? For cooking. Some women work as cow punchers. Teeter on Yellowstone's an example. And Teeter's pretty awesome. But she's the exception versus how many other dudes are in that bunkhouse. How many dudes are in that bunkhouse compared to her? So there may be a few women that can do stuff like that. But for every woman who cooks a meal out of a cookbook for her family, there's 4 chefs who are creating recipes on their own. For every woman who's making barbecue ribs in a crock pot with just some barbecue sauce, there's 4 men going and cutting the wood and chipping it and soaking it and bringing you some awesome smoked barbecue. How come if a home breaks up, if the children go to the mama, they have a higher propensity to live a chaotic life than if a home breaks up and the children go to the father? They have just as much of a chance of having a successful life as if they were raised in a 2-parent family. Remember, there's only 2 things women can do that men cannot do. But for everything that a woman can do, other than those 2 things, men often do better or just as well. And there's a whole lot of things that men can do that women cannot do. They just can't. Then let's go back to the steel mills of old, okay? Yes, there were a lot of women that worked in textile mills because women in the home before they had textile mills worked a spinning wheel. That's a feminine job, okay? Got it. Good. But who mined the coal or killed the whales for the oil or later on drilled for the kerosene and the gasoline and the oil that powered those machines? And lubricated those machines in that textile mill. Can a man work in a textile mill? Yes, he can. He can do that. But how many women do all that other stuff? Oh, there might be a few. Very few. But the propensity of them are men. Who mines the iron ore, presses it into taconite, takes it to a mill, mixes it with coal, smelts it, makes it into steel? Versus how many women are participating in that activity? For 2 years, I worked in a copper mine. There were women in the lab. There were women in the offices. There were a few women in the mill, maybe 1 or 2. There were women truck drivers, some, driving the haul trucks. That's an easier job, believe it or not. But there were a few women working the shovels. But in the mills and the crushers, you had to work with the chemicals, where you had to shovel all the ore that fell off the belts, where you had to go weekly and bust all the gravel and all the crushed rock out of the primary crusher and shovel all that stuff down and prep it for maintenance. Most of the welders, most of the guys who maintain the heavy machinery, all of them were men. I think we had one female crusher operator for a little while. One, but she was kind of like the bufferilla type. But I was in the mill and the crusher, doing hard labor, all swinging dicks, just so that way you could have copper wiring, copper plumbing, in a copper, gold, and silver mine in Arizona. Truck driving. There are a lot of female drivers. 30% of the truck drivers are women. Half of that 30% are team drivers with their husbands or boyfriends. So, yes, there are some women that work in men's spaces, but for everything that a man does, or everything that a woman can do, a man can do, and a man is capable of doing more than a woman. That's a fact. Pure fact. I can pick up a railroad tie by myself. I can move it by myself. I can drill it by myself. I can drive the stakes into the ground to hold it in place by myself. I can drive a fence post by myself. I can move roofing supplies up on a roof by myself. How come everybody who delivers furniture are men? How come there's a company named Two Men in a Truck that's a moving company? Where's two women in a truck? I delivered furniture for 2 years. I was a driver and I had a helper. In that whole warehouse, all of the delivery staff in that warehouse were men. Every single one of them. Not a woman to be found. There was a woman working in returns, processing the paperwork and tracking the paperwork for the returns. There were women up in the dispatch office and a couple men. But there weren't women on those forklifts pulling that furniture down from those lofts and putting it on the floor and wrapping it to be put in those cages to be delivered. There was one woman working in receiving, and she didn't last very long. There wasn't a woman working in returns other than the one that was processing the paperwork, that was taking the furniture that was brought back and moving it either to the shop or putting it back on the shelf. There wasn't a single woman working in the repair shop repairing that furniture. Why is that? Some of that furniture was like reclining sofas, high-end heavy tables, and sometimes if we had to deliver it in the city, we'd have to climb up 3 or 4 stories with that stuff on our backs. Woman can't do that. Man can. Sometimes it would take 2 men. And that just about killed us. That's not to say women aren't valuable. They're valuable in their spaces. But you know what? If there's no woman in the home, a man can run a home, a man can cook, a man can clean, a man can cook. Most men, if they learn how to cook, actually cook better than women do. Most men, if they learn how to clean, actually clean better than women do. And faster, too. Let's talk about nerds. You know, a lot of women, there was a podcast I watched today, Anchorman, and he was talking about a woman who came up and said, well, I prefer the nerdy types because they're softer. And you know what? Let's talk about nerdy male energy. Let's do that, okay? Let's talk about nerdy men. Steve Jobs may not have been built like me. Steve Jobs may not have been moving railroad ties around his yard or delivering furniture or working in a mine mill, okay? Or doing what I do now, okay? Or putting a roof on his house, okay? Steve Jobs may not have been that type of man, but Steve Jobs, being the nerd that he is, still was full of masculine energy. Why? Because even the nerds, the nerdy men that are successful are still full of masculine energy. What did Steve Jobs build? What did Steve Jobs create? You cannot tell me that the creation of Apple products, starting with him working out of his parents' garage as a nerdy man, but creating what he did, is not what we call toxic masculinity. Steve Jobs, even though he wasn't a man like me, was still a man's man, a very masculine man. A nerdy man, but a man's man. And oh, by the way, I'm a nerd too. I worked as an engineer for 20 years. The equivalent, my military MOS, I didn't go to college for this and I didn't certify for college credits, but my equivalent training for what I did in the military is the same as being both an electrical systems engineer, electrical engineer, a radio systems engineer, and a satellite systems engineer. And it required me also to be an infantryman too. So I had to be all four, and I had to do both sides of the masculine thing, because when you're setting up those, unless you're working in a strategic side for your entire career, if you're working forward and you're having to work with that field equipment, you have to set it up there and down, set it up there and down. And some of that stuff's heavy. And you have to be a nerd at the same time. Full on masculinity on both sides. If the STEM fields weren't masculine, how come they have to push women into STEM? How come women don't just gravitate towards STEM naturally? Like Steve Jobs did. Like Albert Einstein did. Like Nikola Tesla did. Yes, we had Madame Curie. She is an exception, not the rule. Like Thomas Edison did. Like John David Rockefeller did, like Andrew Carnegie did. Those were all engineering, STEM type people. So, if STEM wasn't masculine, how come they have to push women towards it? How come they don't gravitate towards that naturally, and they have to be encouraged to do that? So, even though Steve Jobs may have had spindly arms and was a vegan and expressed his masculinity through being a total goofball nerd, you know what? still full of masculinity. Look at what he created. He's still a man's man, even though he was a nerd. So to that woman who says that she likes the soft, nerdy types, guess what? Go ahead and hook up with a nerd. You know what? Unless that nerd is just a total goofball, and he's an actual, real nerd who produces and creates things as a man, he's still masculine. You're still not going to get what you say you want. You're just going to get a different version of a man. Full on. So at the end of the day, even though I've got a beard and muscles and stuff like that, and Steve Jobs didn't, okay, in actuality, when it comes down to it, it wouldn't matter if you would have picked me or Steve Jobs, you're still going to get a masculine man. Maybe presenting in different ways, but it's still going to be a masculine man. How many men work in production versus women? There you go. What's the percentages? Which leads me to my next point. Elon Musk. Look, buddy, and Vivek Ramaswamy. HB1 visas for Indian people and in the tech world. Y'all screwed up on that, okay, kind of. Saying we need more of those people because Indian people are brilliant engineers and stuff like that. Y'all screwed up, and let me tell you why. American men, up until 5 decades ago, and Japanese men in Japan, and Korean men in Korea. Let's use those 3 countries, all right? They created General Motors, Ford, Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, Kia, Nippon Steel, U.S. Steel. Let's look at the banking world. Morgan, Samsung, all that stuff, right? Men. Of those cultures. So, instead of trying to rob American men, and the video I was listening to was white men, but let's be honest, okay? I've worked in the trades my entire life, and I've seen this. So it doesn't matter if it's Indian men on H-1B visas or Mexican men on construction sites. I have watched from when I was a young man working as a guy who maintained properties in high school for a construction company, and then working construction jobs through high school and up until I joined the military. It was pretty evenly spread between Latin Americans, Black Americans, and white Americans in the trades. Now you go up on a construction site and you better know Spanish. I'm not talking Latin Americans. You better know Spanish. Not a white dude or black dude to be found. Or if they're there, there's not very many of them. Some of the supers might be, but even most of the supers now, you might want to know Spanish. You go on a tech floor, and isn't it funny that when I got out of the military, with all the technical training I have, I had to turn and do something else. Why is that? I had 20 years of experience in that. And as a satellite operator, I worked with black guys, white guys, Japanese American guys. You know, there was Iranian American guys, Jewish American guys that I worked with, and a few women too. But as soon as I got out, I tried to go into the tech industry with all of the engineering prowess that I knew and I learned, and all the technological skills that I had. In 2012, when I got out of the Army, I could not find a job in that industry anywhere. As a foundational white male American. And you know what? A lot of the foundational black American men who worked alongside me, they had the same problem. Elon, Vivek. But yet, you go on a tech floor today, and it's all Vietnamese guys and Indian guys and gals. All here on visas. If I go and hire onto a construction site as a carpenter, as a laborer, as a roofer, as an electrician, I let that certification go a long time ago. I gave that up. Why? Because I don't know enough Spanish, which is a lie because I do, but I don't look like I do. And I know there's a lot of black men who are also in the trades who face the same problem. Let me try and get a job on a call center floor. Or a foundational black American man try and get a job on a call center floor. Oh, but the visa holders and the women will get that job before I do. And all this stuff I talked about masculinity, let's be honest. The two most masculine groups of men in America are white men and black men. And for all intents and purposes in this discussion, we're equal. We pretty much have a lot of the same traits in how we carry ourselves. It doesn't matter if he's a cowboy or if he's a country dude or a black guy who, is a little bit more. But when you really break it down, as per Thomas Sowell, we're pretty much black men and white men in America. Now, we're the same guy. It's just one of us has a darker suntan, but we're essentially the same, and we're treated the same. In the professional world, and in the trades, and in our homes, and in our communities. Because up until 50 years ago, it was the black man and the white man who were the coal miners, the steel mill operators, the linemen, the nerds. That was us, black men and white men, and the masculine leaders in our worlds. Now, it's almost a crime. So, for those of you who like to say, well, this demographic group or that demographic group is the least protected, least honored, least respected demographic group in America, that's a lie. The foundational white male American / foundational black male American are one demographic group now, and we are the least respected, least protected, least considered demographic in the United States. This is AL-BINO signing out.